You have 10 minutes to disappear, Claire. Take what fits and leave the keys. That's what my father said the night I stopped being his daughter. I was 17, standing barefoot on the cold marble floor of our mansion in Savannah, Georgia, holding a positive pregnancy test. My mother stared at me like I was a stain on her designer rug. My father didn't shout. That would have been too emotional for a man obsessed with image. He simply packed my suitcase, placed it by the door, and turned the family portrait face down. In that moment, I learned that silence can hurt louder than screaming. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story touches something in you, if you've ever been judged by the people who should have loved you most, please subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I truly read them all, and they remind me that no one heals alone. My name is Claire Bennett, and 20 years ago, my parents called me a disgrace for getting pregnant. I was a scholarship student in a private school where last names opened doors, and mine, Bennett, was supposed to mean perfection. But perfection shattered the night they threw me out into the rain with 10 minutes to erase 17 years of being their daughter. The suitcase they handed me was the same one they'd bought for my college tours. Inside, I stuffed a few clothes, a silver cross necklace my grandmother had given me, and $78 from my savings jar. My mother's parting words still echo, "Don't call us. Don't come back. We'll tell everyone you're studying abroad." So I walked, past the iron gates, past the hedgeroses she loved, past every version of the future I'd been told I didn't deserve anymore. It was October. The air smelled of salt and magnolia, and I remember thinking that the world looked almost too beautiful for the moment it ended. At 17, you don't really understand what homeless means until you're sleeping on a park bench, and every passing car feels like judgment. I remember clutching my stomach, whispering to the tiny heartbeat inside me, "It's okay." I'll find a way. I didn't know then that the woman who would save me was already awake that morning, walking her old Labrador past the gazebo where I cried. That night was the end of one life, but it was also the beginning of the one that would change everything. Because sometimes, being thrown away is how you find where you truly belong. The next morning, the sky was pale gray, and the world smelled of wet asphalt. I woke to the sound of an old dog's paws patting closer. When I opened my eyes, a woman in a beige cashmere coat stood beside me, holding a leash and a cup of coffee. Her face carried the calm of someone who had seen both grief and grace. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you'll freeze to death out here." I wanted to lie, to say I was waiting for someone, that I wasn't what I looked like. A 17-year-old pregnant girl sleeping on a park bench with a suitcase for a pillow, but the words wouldn't come. My throat burned, and instead I just nodded. She handed me the coffee. "My name's Eleanor Walsh. This is Max." She gestured to the gray-muzzled Labrador wagging his tail beside her. "He's friendlier than he looks." "I'm Claire," I whispered. "I'll be fine." "No, darling," she said. "You won't. Come with me." It should have felt like charity, but it didn't. It felt like oxygen. The car she drove was old but spotless, smelling of lavender and leather. She didn't ask questions, only turned on the seat warmer and said, "You can rest your eyes if you'd like." For the first time in days, I did. When I woke, we were in Eleanor's home, a white stone house tucked behind magnolia trees, quiet and kind in the morning light. Inside, it smelled like cinnamon and thyme. The guest room she led me to had soft blue walls and a handmade quilt. In the corner stood a crib, assembled, waiting. Eleanor watched me notice it. "My daughter was expecting," she said after a pause. "She and her husband were in an accident 5 years ago." "I never could bring myself to take that crib down. I can't stay," I murmured. "Yes, you can." She looked at me with eyes that saw everything and still didn't flinch. "Everyone deserves a safe place to fall apart." I sat on the bed, tears burning through the last of my defenses. She didn't touch me right away, just sat beside me until the shaking stopped. When she finally did reach for my hand, hers was warm and steady, the way a mother's hand should be. That night, I slept in that bed, not as a guest, but as someone who had been silently adopted by Grace. Max snored at my feet like a guardian angel in dog form. For the first time in 72 hours, I didn't dream of being thrown away. I dreamed of holding my child in a world where someone cared whether we lived or died. Weeks turned into months. Eleanor took me to prenatal appointments, cooked meals that smelled like forgiveness, and taught me how to breathe again. She had a way of turning ordinary moments into lessons about strength. "People who abandon you," she said once, pouring tea, "don't define you. The ones who find you do." Under her roof, I started studying again, online classes at night, helping her with paperwork for her catering business by day. She taught me inventory, budgets, scheduling, how to run something, not just survive it. When winter came, she painted the nursery yellow because, as she said, hope needs light. And on a February night wrapped in blizzard wind, I gave birth to Noah, crying, healthy, and perfect. Eleanor held my hand through every contraction, whispered courage when I had none left, and when the nurse asked who she was, she answered, "Her mother." I didn't correct her. I never would. Days became weeks, and weeks turned into a rhythm I hadn't known since childhood, one that sounded like safety. Evelyn's house was quiet but alive, the kind of quiet that felt like peace, not punishment. Each morning she'd hum while watering her hydrangeas, and Pierre would nudge my hand until I joined them outside. It wasn't long before she handed me an apron at the cafe. "You're not just helping me," she said one morning as I clumsily arranged muffins in the display case. "You're learning how to stand again." Ross's cafe sat on the corner of Bay Street and 7th, with wide windows that caught every sunrise. Locals adored Evelyn. They greeted her like family, not like the owner of 3 restaurants and a catering company. To them, she was Mrs. Ross, the woman who remembered birthdays and brought soup to widows in winter. And now, somehow, she was my Mrs. Ross. I started behind the counter, then learned inventory, scheduling, and eventually payroll. I worked until my back ached and my feet swelled, but for the first time, exhaustion felt good. It meant I was building something. Evelyn insisted I keep my GED books under the counter. "Brains before tips," she said. Every night before bed, I studied by the soft glow of the lamp she'd placed on my nightstand. Sometimes she'd pass by my door, pause, and whisper, "Proud of you, Claire." The words healed wounds that "I'm sorry" never could. When winter came, Savannah turned wet and bone cold. Evelyn made sure I had every coat, every craving, every ounce of comfort she could find. And on the first night of February, under the howl of a blizzard rare for Georgia, my son arrived. Evelyn was there for every scream, every breath. She held my hand as the pain stole my voice and whispered, "You can do this, sweetheart. You already have. When he came into the world, pink, loud, alive, she was the one who cut the cord." "What's his name?" she asked, tears shining like rain on glass. "Eli," I said softly. "Eli Ross Bennett." She smiled. Then the world just got better. Those first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and tiny miracles. Evelyn turned her guest room into a nursery, painted stars on the ceiling, and bought a rocking chair that creaked with comfort. She became Grandma Evelyn before Eli even learned to crawl. By the time he turned 2, I had earned my GED and was taking online business classes. Evelyn refused to let me settle for surviving. "You were built to thrive, Claire," she'd say, sliding spreadsheets across the table. "These restaurants will be yours one day if you want them." It was hard to believe. For so long I'd been told I'd ruined everything. But under Evelyn's roof, ruin was just another word for beginning. Eli grew faster than my heart could keep up. At 4, he was helping Pierre fetch the newspaper. At 5, he was reading street signs aloud. "You've got a brilliant one," Evelyn said proudly. "Reminds me of Sophie." I used to wonder if she ever saw me as a replacement for her daughter. One evening, I asked her that directly. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and said, "No, Claire. You're not Sophie's shadow. You're her echo, proof that love doesn't end, it just changes shape." That night I cried quietly into my pillow. Not from sadness, but from something deeper, gratitude so heavy it almost hurt. Years passed and our little world expanded. Evelyn's restaurants thrived. I took over as general manager, learning everything from supplier contracts to staffing. The first time I signed a check with my name on the company letterhead, I thought about that night on the park bench, the girl who had nothing but a suitcase and a heartbeat, and wished she could see this. When Eli turned 10, I took him to the cafe for pie. He pointed to the old newspaper clippings of Evelyn and her late husband opening their first restaurant. "Did Grandma build all this?" he asked. "She did," I said, "and she gave it to me, so one day I can give it to you." He thought for a moment, then smiled. "Then I'll build something for someone else too." In that moment I realized what Evelyn had truly passed on wasn't money or business, it was legacy. Not of blood, but of choice. The legacy of showing up when no one else does. And though I didn't know it yet, the family that once erased me would soon come looking for what they'd thrown away. But this time, I wasn't a scared 17-year-old girl. I was a mother, a businesswoman, and a survivor, with an entire life built on kindness that couldn't be bought or stolen. By the time Eli turned 20, his name was already whispered in hospital corridors and research circles across the state. He'd followed his own calling into medicine, graduating early and becoming one of the youngest cardiothoracic surgeons in the region. The boy who once dissected his stuffed bear to fix its heart now repaired real ones. Evelyn would have been so proud. She passed quietly one spring morning, her hand in mine, sunlight pooling across the quilt she'd made for Eli's birth. She was 90, still sharp, still laughing the day before. Her last words to me were steady. "You built the life I hoped you'd find. Now protect it." After her funeral, I discovered she'd left behind more than memories. There was a trust fund, documents with my name on every page, and a handwritten letter addressed to both Eli and me. It said, "Everything I own, the restaurants, the house, the savings, belongs to you two. But more importantly, so does the responsibility to choose kindness over blood. You'll understand why one day I didn't know what she meant then, but that one day came faster than I expected. One evening, while I was closing up Ross's cafe, Eli burst through the door, still in scrubs, the local paper clutched in his hand. "Mom," he said, breathless, "they ran a full feature on me, front page." The headline read, "Dr. Eli Bennett, youngest heart surgeon to lead department." His photo filled half the page. My son, standing tall in blue scrubs, a quiet smile that reminded me so much of Evelyn's. That same night, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something, maybe habit, maybe intuition, made me answer. "Claire?" The voice froze me. My mother's voice, after 20 years of silence. "We saw the article," she said, her tone smooth but trembling beneath control. "We'd like to meet our grandson." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. "Our grandson," I repeated. "You mean the one you decided didn't exist?" There was silence, then a sigh. "We were wrong. People change. People do change. But not always for the right reasons." Within a week, emails began arriving. Formal, polished, addressed from Bennett Holdings, the same company my father had spent his life guarding like a kingdom. The messages spoke of reconnection, family unity, and shared legacy. Eli noticed my unease long before I said anything. "Who's been calling you?" he asked one night, still scrolling through surgical notes. "Just ghosts," I said. He frowned. "Do I have the right to know which ghosts?" So I told him about the marble floor, the 10 minutes, the door that locked behind me. I thought he'd be angry. Instead, he was heartbreakingly calm. "They're not family, Mom," he said. "You and Grandma are. They don't get to rewrite history because they regret the ending. But regret wasn't their motive. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived by courier, an invitation on heavy paper embossed with gold. The Bennett Family Foundation Gala. They were launching a new corporate branch, highlighting 3 generations of success. My son's name was printed on the guest list. "They're using you," I said, trembling with disbelief. "I know," Eli replied, "which is why we're not walking into their stage. We're building our own." That's when Lance Morgan, my business attorney and dear friend, stepped in. He'd handled Evelyn's estate, ensuring every clause was airtight. When I told him about my parents' sudden interest, he simply nodded. "Let them come," he said. "If their motives are impure, their actions will expose them faster than we ever could." Days later, a reporter from the Savannah Tribune called, asking for a comment. Apparently, my parents had already started spinning a story, the heartwarming reunion between estranged parents and their daughter. It was surreal, seeing my pain turned into their PR strategy. But Lance reminded me, truth doesn't need a spotlight, Claire. It just needs patience. So I waited. The phone calls grew more desperate. My father left voicemails about legacy, my mother about forgiveness. And somewhere in between, I realized Evelyn's final warning had come true. Protect it. Because when money, status, and public image enter the room, love rarely stays. And as I stood in the quiet cafe one night, wiping down the counter Evelyn once leaned on, I knew what had to come next. My parents wanted a show. I'd give them one, just not the ending they expected. The night of the gala arrived like a storm, dressed in silk. The Bennett Foundation charity ball was held at the same hotel where my parents had celebrated their 40th anniversary years ago, before I became the invisible daughter they refused to name. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stood at the top of the marble staircase, watching the chandeliers reflect off champagne glasses and sequined gowns. My parents were exactly as I remembered, elegant, rehearsed, hollow. My father's silver hair was perfectly combed, his expression carved from the same stone as the pillars surrounding him. My mother's pearls caught the light like armor. When they spotted Eli across the room, tall, confident in his dark suit, their faces softened into something that almost resembled love. Almost. "Claire," my mother said, approaching with her hand outstretched as if 20 years could be undone by a manicure. "You look... well..." I met her eyes evenly. "You look practiced." My father cleared his throat, businesslike as ever. "We'd like to discuss the future, as a family." "You mean the company's future?" I replied. "Let's not pretend otherwise." They exchanged a quick glance, the same silent communication they'd used my whole childhood when deciding what part of me needed fixing. My father gestured toward a side table where folders waited. "This isn't about the past, Claire. It's about legacy. Bennett Holdings is expanding its medical division. Eli's brilliance could lead it." Eli stood beside me, arms folded. "You mean use it, not lead it." My mother's voice turned syrupy. "We want to make things right. A public reconciliation would mean so much, for the family name and for you." "Right," I said quietly, "because forgiveness photographs well." The music dimmed. Guests began taking their seats for the program. At the podium, a presenter began reading from cue cards about the enduring Bennett legacy. But before they could continue, Lance walked onto the stage, calm as ever, holding a slim folder. "Good evening," he began. "I represent Ms. Claire Bennett and Dr. Eli Bennett. I was asked to provide a brief acknowledgement before tonight's donation ceremony." My parents stiffened. My mother's hand gripped her champagne flute so tightly her diamond ring clinked against the glass. Lance's voice was steady. "Before we celebrate family legacy, it's important to define what family means. I hold here an original document signed 20 years ago by Robert and Margaret Bennett, formally renouncing all parental rights and financial responsibility for their minor daughter and her unborn child." A hush spread across the ballroom. Cameras lifted. Gasps cut through the music like blades. My father stood abruptly. "This is private. You have no right—" "On the contrary," Lance replied smoothly. "It became public the moment you turned it into a marketing campaign." He projected the scanned document onto the large LED screen behind him. Every word, every signature illuminated like truth carved into glass. The date, October 18th, 2004. My mother's face drained of color. "That's out of context," she stammered. "We were under stress. You had lawyers," I interrupted. "You had choices." Lance turned another page. "There's also an amendment. This relinquishment extends in perpetuity to any descendants, born or unborn, of said minor. Meaning legally, Dr. Eli Bennett is not recognized as your grandson." Whispers rippled through the crowd. A reporter from the Savannah Tribune was already typing furiously. Eli stepped forward, calm and clear. "So when you say you're proud of me," he said softly, "remember that you signed away the right to say those words." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the violins in the corner seemed to hesitate. Lance closed the folder. Furthermore, under the late Evelyn Ross's estate, any individual who previously abandoned or disowned Claire Bennett or her child is permanently barred from receiving any benefit, direct or indirect, from her trust. This includes corporate partnerships, public grants, or donations connected to her businesses. It was over. My parents' legacy unraveled in the space of 3 paragraphs. My father's voice cracked for the first time in my life. "You'll regret this," he whispered. I met his eyes with the calm of someone who'd already survived worse. I already did. Once security approached gently at Lance's signal, not to humiliate, only to ensure order. The cameras followed them as they were escorted out, faces pale under the chandeliers they once owned. When the doors closed, the crowd began to clap, not loud but steady. It wasn't applause for revenge, it was applause for truth. Eli turned to me, eyes bright but composed. "You okay?" "I'm free," I said, meaning every syllable. That night, under the same glittering lights that once witnessed my exile, I didn't feel like the girl with 10 minutes anymore. I felt like the woman who finally took them back. The morning after the gala, sunlight spilled through the cafe windows, catching the dust motes like gold. Everything felt quieter, lighter. The newspaper headlines had already spread across town. For once, I didn't flinch seeing our name printed in bold. It wasn't shame anymore. It was freedom. Eli came in straight from his shift, still in his blue scrubs, exhaustion clinging to his shoulders. He dropped the paper on the counter and smiled faintly. "You did it, Mom." "No," I said, pouring him coffee. "We did it. And Evelyn did it first. Because this victory wasn't about humiliation or revenge, it was about the truth, the kind that heals instead of hurts." That afternoon, we stood together outside the Evelyn Ross Foundation, the new plaque gleaming in the sun. Inside were bright classrooms, a daycare center, and 20 bedrooms for young mothers who needed a place to start over. On one wall hung a photograph of Evelyn holding baby Eli, her eyes full of quiet pride. "She'd love this," Eli said softly. "She'd love you," I answered. When the ribbon fell and applause filled the courtyard, I realized something I'd been chasing for 20 years. I didn't need my parents' forgiveness to feel whole. I'd built my own legacy, the kind that doesn't need marble floors or perfect family portraits to stand tall. Because family isn't blood. It's the people who show up when everyone else leaves. It's kindness passed from hand to hand until it becomes a home. That night, we gathered at our dinner table, the same one Evelyn used to sit at, with the smell of roasted herbs and fresh bread filling the room. Eli laughed at something Lance said, the sound warm and real. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of waves, the same ones I'd heard 20 years ago when I walked away with nothing. I looked around the table, at my son, my husband, the people I'd chosen, and thought, this is the real inheritance. Not money, not revenge, but peace. Before I end this story, I want to speak to anyone who's ever been told they don't belong, who's been pushed out, erased, or left behind. Your story doesn't end where they decided it should. Sometimes being thrown away is how you discover your worth. Sometimes family is found in the arms of strangers who stay. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me what family means to you. Because every view, every word you share here reminds someone out there that they're not alone, and that love, when chosen freely, is the most powerful kind of justice.